Yes, grab a chair, everyone. We've got a couple of microphones ready to come around the audience if we need. If you've got a question, raise your hand and we'll get one to you. Just as we are doing that, I'll get things started. And I suppose, David, I might start with you with some of your work on trade and where you think the water prices will go given what kind of year it is. I suppose one thing that's come up a lot in the last week or so is that there's a lot of competition starting to happen between industries that are booming, like almonds, table grapes and citrus, etc. for water, these permanent plantings. Is that something you can put into your models to decide on how these industries that can pay more for water, how they will compete with each other in dry times?
Yeah, well, that's effectively what our model does. So we've got all the different industries in the model. So we've effectively estimated demand curves for all the different industries. And the way that the model works is it just says, oh, well, given current water availability and all the rules around carryover and trade rules, etc., where is water likely to go? So that's how you take into account in the model.
We've got a question just up here. Yep.
Yep. Rob Harble from ISK Biosciences. My question is, when you're talking about carrying over water and deferring allocation, how do you actually weigh up the evaporation issue? Because I think there's been articles where potentially you lose 20 to 30% in evaporation. So when you're carrying over every day in very hot conditions, and we've had exceptionally hot conditions this year, the evaporation certainly would be higher than lower. How do you weigh that up? You know, if you don't use it, you lose it, kind of thing.
Is that more you, Andrew, I'm guessing?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, to anyone.
Oh, Jody?
So if people carry over water, they retain the right to take that volume of water. So water that's held in storages, we estimate or manage the evaporation each year, and so that's part of assessing how much water is available. In the major storages, Hume and Dartmouth, they're quite deep storages, not particularly large surface areas, particularly Dartmouth. So water that's stored there, having a little bit extra stored there doesn't really change the total evaporation very much. Of course, water that's stored in Menindee, and one of the reasons we call on Menindee and use that water is that it does evaporate quickly, and we lose a lot to evaporation. So we tend to use that to meet demands in the system prior or before we use other water. So carryover itself is not a major influence on the total volume of evaporation year on year, because the evaporation we'll see is related to the surface area of the storage. That's not going to change significantly based on the volumes that have been carried over.
We've got another question just here. Yeah.
So my question's for Andrew. I'm curious about what can be done to get more water into the Murrumbidgee with the trade constraints. So if you have a very dry year next year, particularly with snowy hydro, could there be a way to do a deal with snowy hydro to get more water into Murrumbidgee and less into the Murray if there's a desperate need for it?
So the Snowy Hydro operate under the Snowy Hydro licence, which determines what they need to do. There are volumes of water they're obligated to provide both into the Murrumbidgee and the Murray. I think one of the challenges, particularly next year for the Snowy, is that they're also seeing low inflows to their storages, and they will be very keen, I think, to make sure that they use the water that's available to them in the most effective way to generate electricity. So particularly in the Murrumbidgee, it would be an issue for New South Wales and Snowy Hydro if there was something to be done there. I think the outlook might see that quite difficult to negotiate.
Get your hand up if you'd like a question. We'll bring a microphone to you. I suppose just continuing on from that too, Andrew, in some of what you were talking about, and also looking at the figures from David showing where the water is leaving out of certain regions and its net deficit. Is it going to be harder to physically deliver some of this water further down, say the Murray, for example, in a wetter year when there's a lot of allocation and, say, a lot of demand for it from further down the Murray system?
Yes, and we're acutely aware of that, and we're doing a lot of work now to understand how those demands might change and you know, what sort of volumes might be expected to be delivered in other places in the system. One of the challenges for us is to get the balance between holding water in the upstream storages where it's most efficient to store it from an evaporation point of view and other things, and then taking the opportunity to harvest any inflows that come in from the tributaries downstream of those storages into Lake Victoria. The trouble is, as happened in this current season, the longer we leave that, if those tributary flows don't emerge and then we need to pass water through the system to catch up, we end up having to run the system very hard.
And that's where a lot of questions have come with the Barmah choke this season.
That's right, and that can be less efficient, but it is a trade-off between trying to take the opportunity to harvest extra water if it comes into the system, which would make more water overall available, versus the risk of moving it early and spilling it. So it's the challenge for any river operator, and trying to forecast what might happen over the next few months is always a challenge.
Is it getting harder, just in a word?
I think we're seeing changes in recent years in climate, and be it climate change or natural variability or whatever, and there'll be lots of opinions about that. We are seeing changes in inflow patterns that some of our rules of thumb that have served us very well for a long time, you know, don't serve us quite so well now.
Mike?
Yeah, Mike Foley from the Land newspaper. Just one for the panel, whoever. It'd be good if all of you could have a crack at it, actually. Given the socio-economics we've seen to date under current water recovery, capped at 1,500 gig, there's a bit to go, as we know. What further impacts or outcomes would you expect to see if buybacks were extended above and beyond that cap?
Who would like to go first on that? Everyone's looking at each other.
I can go first, but I'm the least qualified to answer. So I guess to get that out of the way, from our perspective, when we hold water within our portfolio, it actually doesn't matter where it comes from, whether it comes from buybacks or efficiency measures. So it is very much a societal question of how to think about what the best way is to get that water back and be able to support communities. So I guess I'm not able to answer Mike in terms of socio-economic impacts, except for to sort of say that in the end product to us, it doesn't actually matter where it comes from. So it's really a decision about how to best do that and support the industry and the sustainability of the basin.
Noel, I might go to you next. What do you think would happen to your community if there were more buybacks?
I would be very disappointed if buybacks returned to our area. There's already been a massive amount of water permanently left our area. Any further buybacks will be incredibly destructive or detrimental to our area, our communities, the area as we know it. It's already a massive problem. You know, it's a combination of the buybacks and the yield on our remaining entitlements, the third-party impacts that are affecting us. We don't seem to be getting the yield on our entitlements we used to be, let alone losing even more water. Like, there was a rally in Melbourne a few months back trying to stop the 450. There's no way any further water can be recovered from our area without having socio-economic and pass that test, sorry. So I don't want to see any more water leave our area under any circumstances if I can do anything about it, or we can as a community, because it's not required and it shouldn't happen.
David, I suppose just looking at your work, how would that change your forecast modelling if there was less water effectively then to be allocated for trade?
Yeah, so we could, in our model, we can, you know, because it's got supply of water in there, we could run a scenario where there's a bit less water in the system and provide some sort of estimate of what the impact on prices might be. Past work that we've done, I can't remember the exact number off the top of my head, but it was something like, in the order of on the water market, about $30 to $40 per megalitre from the buybacks to date. Important to acknowledge, though, that didn't include the infrastructure investments, which you'd expect might help move it back the other way. But yeah, feasibly, you could do some certain analysis on that.
Anything to add on this one, Andrew?
I think the one thing from our perspective is that the implementation of the STL adjustment projects, which, you know, are a way of avoiding needing to buy further water, is absolutely critical, and, you know, we'd like to see progress on those, and communities need to be involved in that state governments need to lead those projects, and the Commonwealth's certainly willing to help. So I think it does highlight the imperative of making progress on those projects as well.
So hurry up, state governments. We've got a question up here.
This is a question for David. Under a climate change outlook, where there's less water availability, any insights into the different agricultural markets in the Murray, for example, the annual versus perennial, and their sort of viability and feasibility, given there'll be some competition for water?
Sure. So we haven't run any climate change scenarios through the water trade model, but again, that would be feasible for us to do to try and explain how we might see a shift in which industries are picking up in which areas or reducing in other areas. In some other work that we've done, it's more on the dry land side of things, we've done some work on what's the effect of the climate for the last 20 odd years being on farm cash income compared to the 30 or 40 years before that. And if you look at that on a map, there's some fairly large red areas in the sheep wheat zone in WA and in some of the western parts of New South Wales and into Victoria. So yes, it's feasible to do that work, but I don't have a crystal ball or I can't calculate that in my head without running it through the model.
And put your hand up if you'd like a question. The microphones are still going around. Jody, while we wait, I might ask a question to you. In terms of dealing with the trading market, you gave the example of how many licences and different markets you're operating in. Are there rules that you would like to see changed to make things easier for you as an environmental water holder? Is there something that you're keeping an eye on?
Thank you. Not anything specifically, I guess, that we're targeting on the trading front. We trade probably less often than we'd like to in the future, and at the moment they've all been sales rather than purchases. And in an outlook like this, it's very hard for us to think that we would buy enough water to actually make a difference to the environment. But we need to be able to keep that portfolio to service the landscape, if you like. But there's not particular trade rules as such, because I think most of them make logical sense. A lot of the rules that I guess we want to see modified over time, or not modified, but better articulated, is how our water is delivered in stream and what accounting actually then applies to that. Being able to actually get our water out of the Murrumbidgee, for instance, and down through and get that credited in the Murray is a big issue that at the moment we're dealing with both state and the MDBA on. So it's more those types of rules. I might just go back, because I didn't get to talk to the gentleman's question about the carryover from our perspective.
Because there are some farmers that suggest, or not even farmers, politicians that suggest you shouldn't be able to carry over water.
So the basis of the reforms has been that the entitlements will keep the same characteristics, and it was done that way to try and put the environment on a level playing field to a certain extent. So keeping those characteristics is important. For us, carryover is important, as I illustrated, but we do actually try and benchmark ourselves and make sure that we're not carrying over in a wildly different pattern or anything than others. And in the Southern Basin, that's definitely been the case, that our level of carryover is no different than the broader irrigation area. In the north, it is a bit different because of the continuous accounting rules. So we've utilised that possibly a bit more than other people do, because they get in and make the money while they can.
Next question, Steve Wan.
Steve Wan from National Irrigators Council. Question first, I might have two if I can, but let's see how we go. Question first, probably for Andrew and David. With the constraints issues and development issues that you're talking about in the Western Murray, and the difficulties of potentially in the future of delivering water, and not just in wet times, but the sequence that we've got at the moment with no inflows from tributaries, do you see a role for a delivery entitlement system in assisting with that? And my second question, perhaps to you and also to Noel, what do your areas need to do to actually attract people back in with their water?
Well, I'll let you guys start with the first question if you'd like. To unpack that one.
So I guess in the concept of a delivery entitlement, it works well in channel networks. The complexity of the river system and the tributaries and the intersection of state entitlement frameworks and the like would make that a very, very complex thing to implement. I wouldn't say that we shouldn't tackle it, but I think it would be a long-term and challenging thing to implement.
Anything to add, David?
No, I mean, Andrew's a river ops expert. I mean, I guess I'll just come back to the point I made before about it's worth exploring all this as an example and others because, there'll be challenges in the future about moving water around, but Andrew's the guru on the actual day-to-day, what are the complexities. So.
Noel, would you like to talk about encouraging water back to your area?
Yeah, I mean, water will flow back in our area, and I mean, it's still flowing in our area, but one thing that needs to happen is the reliability or the yield on our entitlements needs to return to pre-basin plan. The basin plan has been implemented and everyone's okay with that as long as it doesn't have too many third-party impacts. Issues with where the water's being used, leading to increased river losses, stuff like that, we believe is resulting in a lower yield on our entitlements, and that is reducing the water pool we've got. So if we can get that back to where it used to be, stick to constraints, sharing of the river losses, because the whole water system has changed now that there's such a big water holder in the Commonwealth and demand where it's being used. So maybe some of the rules are now outdated and need updating to work with the current water environment, and that will in turn lead to us getting a better yield on our entitlements and encourage water use in our area again. And we'll stop it going backwards any further.
Do you want to add to that, Joe? Yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind, because I guess the premise of the basin plan was to stop any third-party impacts, and I think we work with state agencies and I have very open discussions with everyone about losses in the system and how they're accounted for, and I guess I would think that I don't imagine that the way the system is operating is actually the thing that's changing your reliability profile. It might be, just that we've had a drier sequence and the fact that it's very spatially uneven where the water's coming from in the basin and what that means for operations of the River Murray. But I'm very happy to keep working with people to talk through that delivery losses issue. We do pay higher losses when the river is being run higher at our request. And so I think that is something to get transparent and out in the public domain, but I guess I would say that governments have worked very closely to try and make sure that there aren't that type of third-party impacts, and often we pay very conservative losses because state governments are very keen to make sure that we don't have any third-party impact. So,
Yep.
There you go. Steve, you don't need my opinion anyway. It's not as well researched as the others. Let's go to the front for a question here.
Nerida Kerr. I'm with the Rural Financial Counselling Services North East Victoria and work in the Goulburn Valley area in particular. Unfortunately, we're in an absolutely booming industry at the moment, and that's helping farmers going through terrible losses at the moment. My question is, given the carnage in the dairy industry and the struggles at Hort, and we work with farmers like Noel and Emma every day, they're good farmers, really good farmers. Is there any appetite to build fairness back into the water markets? Because how can the family farm compete with corporates and speculators? So how can we, maintain our communities when you've got big corporates with big dollars, but you've got really good farmers who just are competed out of the market for water?
Yeah, I'll track of that. So look, I guess this is a tricky one, isn't it? Because if we go right back to the National Water Initiative, and one of the ideas there was to have free trade of water, so it flowed to its highest value use. Yeah, so that's what it gets to. So that's what the NWI states. But of course, there's clear trade-offs with that, isn't there? So by governments choosing that's the path they want to go down, there are these structural changes that will occur with industry. So you will see industries come and go, and water move from region to region. And I guess that's kind of the choice that's been made back then in deciding to go to free water trade. So. But it's not to say there aren't these impacts. Of course there are. It's a tricky thing to manage. Yeah.
Next question is just here.
I've got to say, I think everyone probably cares, and it's very difficult to see that occurring in those industries. I think that following on from David's point, governments in a democracy find it very hard to tell people what they should grow or do, or put confines around what irrigation districts should do, or where the water should move in or out. So I think that governments won't make that call, and whether there are some systems to be able to try and think about the broader implications of some of the moving and make that clear, especially where it actually doesn't need to move, because at some other time it might be profitable, whether there's sort of some insight that the industries can give to help support. I think it's a really difficult question, and I think that that market aspiration of moving to the highest value use is actually, if you think about water being a very scarce resource, that's going to happen not just in Australia but all over the planet, as we increasingly deplete our freshwater resources and try and figure out what to do. So the objective in some ways is noble, but I can see that we see every day when we talk to those people in those valleys, those impacts. So I think a lot of people care. It's just whether you can take the train off the rails and what the justification for that would be.
Yep. Richard Dickman, question for you, Noel. So thanks for your initiative and your service in really changing your business, in the service of agriculture and the environment, driving efficiency. Again, on a similar theme, looking forward, your son was in front of a cotton plant. Are you going to be inexorably, drawn into more and more efficient, dollar-efficient agriculture? Will he be standing in front of an almond tree in the future, and it'll just be a monoculture of the highest value, crops? And how do you feel about that?
Yeah, well, I suppose the summary of that is I hope I won't be standing in front of an almond tree, or my son won't be. I certainly see how the market works, and water is getting drawn to those high value crops. One thing, since I've been in the water industry, and I've said to several people, and it doesn't seem to get enough traction, that in our area we grow basic human need food. Milk, bread, beef, dairy, rice, cotton, wool, those sort of things. We can't pay as much money as the almond or the grape guys, but they're growing what I would refer to as luxury items. How is that best to feed the world? I've got nothing against those people, and I know they can pay bigger dollars because they have to keep their trees alive. But where we're located, we're close to the storages, we're above the choke, we're a great area to use water. We feed the world, we feed the nation. It's a very important thing to do. So I hope we can maintain farming the way we know it. I certainly do encourage permanent plantings, not in our area, I'm not against them at all, but there needs to be a balance. And we need to be able to grow the food the country needs. One thing I would like to say that I was going to say in my speech, there's a lot of talk about getting agricultural commodities to 100 billion in the next 10 years. All the water that is taken away out of the consumptive pool is worth billions of dollars. I'm not against basin planting, but it just needs to be balanced. Right now when I look on the river data, I think there's 1,000 megs flowing into MurrayIrrigation, and a lot of that's probably flowing out the escapes to go further down the river. There's something like 6,000 megs at Lock 1 and 4 gates open to the ocean. So, in a time of drought. So, yet meanwhile, we've got lots of people in rural communities really doing it incredibly tough. So, yeah, that's it.
Next question.
Gary Nairn, I'm the chairman of the Malone Institute. This whole debate is constantly about a finite amount of water. Yes, that finite amount of water changes every year depending on the rainfalls and various things, and you adapt your models accordingly. But perhaps there should be a bit more concentration on changing that finite amount of water, and that means repairing and fixing up the tributaries and the landscapes and the catchments that run into the Murray-Darling, which are, many of which are incredibly degraded, and therefore not being able to maximise the amount of water that actually falls out of the sky, and so much of it is lost before it even gets there. So instead of investing in buying back, or talking about investing in buying back water to take out of the system, perhaps it should be investing in fixing the broader system, so that there's that finite amount of water is actually finite plus X or Y.
I'm happy to comment on that, not really from my current role, but probably even previous experience. Look, I think that that's an important comment. I agree there are a lot of areas that are quite degraded in the landscape, which are important to feeding the main river systems. States have moved over a couple of decades to try and actually put controls, on farm dams and all sorts of other things, obstructions in the river to try and stop some of what might be a diminishment of flow downstream. But there is also then a fairly complex property right issue about the people whose landscape that falls on upstream, and whether they can harness part of that resource. And I was in New South Wales working for the government when they actually put the 10% limit or whatever it was on farm dams, and said, in terms of what they can capture of rain that originates on their property. I think that, there's a crossover now to those complex property right issues around things like floodplain harvesting, but the whole catchment and the whole basin does need to be looked at, not just the main regulated reaches.
And just before we finish up here today, also being an ABC person, I love finishing on time, but I can't leave you without this. It's obviously for all of you, no matter what position you're in, and in the Murray-Darling, it's a highly charged political time. I could have almost said that at any time during this debate, but it feels after the fish kill, and when we're talking about people, particularly like dairy farms and so forth, leaving northern Victoria at the moment that I'm familiar with, it does feel like a time that's highly charged around the Murray-Darling debate. Some states have threatened to walk away from the Basin Plan. What would happen to your role, or what your research is looking at, if the Basin Plan fell apart?
So the Basin Plan is a once in a generation or even longer chance to reset the balance. I think over 100 odd years of development, the balance was way out of kilter, and we're trying to get that back to something. And there's some pain that goes along with that, there's no doubt. Where that balance is will always be subjective. I think if the Basin Plan, if we don't stay the course on the Basin Plan and see it through, then we won't get this opportunity again for a very, very long time, and the sustainability of communities and the environment will all suffer as a result.
What happens to your work, David, if there's no Basin Plan?
Oh, well, first, I guess I don't particularly want to contemplate that scenario, but and it would depend a bit on what you mean by it falls apart, because obviously the environmental water holder does have a certain amount of entitlement, so it depends on what we mean by fall apart. Do they go back to irrigators or not? But my guess is that the water market will still exist, so it'll just really be a question if it's about the volume of water. It's just about how much of the water is for consumptive use versus environmental use. So assuming water trade is here to stay, it's just about the total volume of water. Yeah.
Does your job get harder, Jody, in terms of delivering and what you can actually do with the water that you've got if states start threatening to walk away and actually back that up?
Of course, we work very closely with states, and so there's a lot of good faith that we rely on in terms of how they work with us and allow us to use our water in the system. So the good faith element is very important. To me, the basin plan, as Andrew said, it's not just that once in a lifetime opportunity, but the whole reason of having it, the logic was that we have to sustain the landscape so it can continue sustaining us. And so if governments walk away, it would be, you know, a devastating loss really for the sustainable future, I think, not just of the basin from an environmental perspective, but also from an irrigated agriculture perspective. And there's lots of civilisations that have changed radically over time as irrigation schemes have fallen in a hole and landscapes have become desertified and stuff like that. You have to read a bit of history really, but I think it would, you know, it's a fantastic opportunity. People are urging people to stay the course, and I think that that's really important to work through all of the sort of ups and downs and pros and cons and things about how our water is mobilised in the system. In the end, our function is created under the Water Act, not the Basin Plan, and so it would continue, and I assume we would continue managing the portfolio that we already have if there was any stalling of some of the rollout here, but I guess I'm one of those people who would be urging people to stay the course.
And Noel, as your state's minister, that's probably the most vocal in terms of walking away at the moment. It's been other states at different times. How do you feel about that?
I mean, it's hard for me to say whether walking away from the plan is the best outcome. Depends what happens if it's recommenced, I suppose, whether we end up better or worse off. But as far as the plan and what's left to go, I mean, the 450, in my view, shouldn't be recovered. It's above upwater, they call it. There's really no need to recover that, I don't believe. So, you know, the SDL projects, if they achieve what they're supposed to, they'll save further water recovery. I think generally as a whole, most irrigators can handle what's been recovered so far, as long as there's no more third-party impacts, and we get the yield of our entitlements back to where they used to, everyone would be okay with what's happened.
Well, thank you everybody for coming to this session this afternoon and water nerding out with us all. And please thank our panel, Andrew Reynolds, David Galliano, Jodie Squirrepick and Noel Baxter. Enjoy your lunch.